Chairman McCall, thanks for being here. A big NATO summit upcoming, of course, this week. Today, of course, we had the tragic news of an attack by the Russians on a children's hospital in Kiev. This is a key moment for the Allies because they seem to be taking greater steps to be security guarantors for Ukraine. You've been pressing on the administration here to be much more aggressive in sending aid. Where does the path come from to get the Ukrainians on the stair-step to victory? Because we've seen the war go much more defensive, go into much more of a stalemate this year.
Well, and thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here, by the way. I pushed the supplemental very hard to get passed. That was Israel, Ukraine, Indo-Pacific. All three are, you got two hot wars and one hot zone in the Pacific. On the weapons, I sign off on all foreign military weapon sales and financing. I've been pushing the administration really since day one of the conflict. First, it was Stingers and Javelins and HIMARS, then all the way up to the F-16. Jake Sullivan, we agree to disagree. We strongly disagree in terms of, it's too provocative. I think once China was very clear, the PRC, that they would not join Russia if they used the short-range tactical nuke, that took a lot of the threat, I think, off the table in terms of provocation. So where are we today?
The administration taking the threat of
look, they're not going to, and that could potentially invoke Article 5, depending on how the plume would go. So on the ATACMS, I literally wrote that into the supplemental that the United States, the administration shall provide ATACMS. These are the longer range artillery that every time I meet with the Ukrainians, and I met with Zelensky both in Singapore at the Security Summit and also after Normandy and Paris, they need ATACMS. So we provided that to them. That was the intent of Congress. So then they said, look, we can't hit across the border of Kharkiv into Russia. And after some friction, they changed the policy to allow them to just hit cross-border. It'd be reminiscent of Cambodia and the Vietnam War. Well, they changed the policy. That was good. But yet they still restricted the very weapons that could be utilized to achieve that goal. And that is the short-range ATACMS. About 150 kilometers, long range or 300. We've got a great map if y'all want to ever see it. And it shows you how ridiculous this policy is. And I told Zelensky, I'm going to take this back to the administration, and I did. But without a victory, if all they have is a stalemate and a war of attrition, that long-term, that is not good. And they're going to lose the will of the American people. American people want to see a victory. And that takes Ukraine closer to status of, say, like EU or potentially down the road, the NATO.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'd be curious to know more about. I mean, we saw when the Ukrainians were really on the offensive, gaining victories in Kharkiv, in Kherson back in 2022. You saw just the trajectory of American public support going up and up and up. Now we've seen it kind of stagnate, stumble out. I mean, even if they get this targeting capability, does that put the Ukrainians on a path where they can sort of get that drumbeat of victories to get public support, especially since we've seen the supplemental be such a challenge and Trump himself, potentially the next president, coming out and saying he'd go right to the negotiating table with the Russians?
Yeah, or he'll say it would have happened if our president, that may be true, actually. I think we need to not tie one hand behind their back and give them everything they need to win. They've demonstrated that they can fight what we thought was one of the greatest militaries on the planet, which turns out not to be true. So for God's sakes, give them what they need and let them have let them achieve victory. I believe when you go over there, they're very seasoned, they're very battle hardened, yet we're tying, again, one hand where they could at least push the Russians out as far as they possibly can, so that then you could have a ceasefire and negotiate a peace agreement. My argument to my colleagues was if you unilaterally pull out if you abandon our NATO allies and pull out of Ukraine altogether, you're going to see what the polls tell me it looks like 1939, and they're going to expand. You got Moldova right there with no NATO protection at all, and Georgia, and then you got the eastern bloc countries, that the Balkans and the Baltic states that could be at threat, even though they're under Article 5 status.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious too. You've talked a lot about within the American body politic, within parts of the Republican Party, you see sort of this climate. And I know you talked with Puck News about this, where pro-Russia thinking is becoming more prevalent in some wings of the Republican Party and in some parts of the American body politic. How do you think this undermines confidence potentially in NATO, in the Ukrainian war effort, and if we were to face sort of an Article 5 scenario, does that leave the American role in question?
Well, there's this false dichotomy, this false narrative that you had to choose between protecting our southern border and protecting Eastern Europe from the biggest threat we've seen since probably World War II. And I would argue they're not mutually exclusive. We can do both. And that, you know what, at the end of the day, that prevailed on the House floor. I asked the question, ask yourself, are you a Churchill or a Chamberlain? And that is fundamentally the issue right now. I think that, actually, we thought the backlash politically was going to be far more severe than it actually was. I talked to so many members that voted yes on Ukraine, thinking they'd have to go home, and take a little bit of a beating, and they surprisingly did not. There was a great poll done by the Reagan Institute about this sort of theory, or that the Republican Party is not pro-victory, pro-Ukraine, and the polling actually shows a very different scenario. It actually, even with the so-called MAGA group, that they also don't want to see nobody wants to see the United States lose. American people don't like losers. We like winners, and they look at the situation. And that's why I told Zelensky, you have to score some victories, but we got to let them use these attack-ums.
So you would still state that the core of Republican support for the Ukrainians is holding in spite of what we've seen around the supplemental.
The polling I've seen indicates that very strong. And look, Reagan, first president I got to vote for in 1980, was very not isolationist. He was very, United States has to lead the free world, and he truly believed in that. And I don't think, I know it's popular to say that Republicans are isolationists. I don't know if that's actually true. As for myself, I think the issue is historically, when you look at the younger members of Congress, they don't remember the Cold War like I did. All they know is Iraq and Afghanistan. These forever wars that went on and on and on for 20 plus years. And they're war fatigued, just like the American people were in a parallel universe in the late 1930s. World War I was a brutal trench warfare. And the sense at that time was, look, let Europe handle its own problems. We got our own problems back here. And I think that's some of maybe what you're seeing because of the forever wars. And that's why we do believe that the Europeans have to step it up, and NATO, which quite honestly they have. Only 8 NATO nations have not met the 2% goal. That's pretty impressive. And Finland and Sweden now have joined NATO. I've been to both countries, very strong militaries. They have a lot to bring to the table. The irony is that if Putin was trying to weaken NATO, he accomplished just the opposite. He has a far stronger NATO now.
I'm curious, as you look at these headwinds, and you just sort of mentioned them, sort of the nationalism, the nativism that we see on both sides of the Atlantic, how do you see that continuing to impact NATO, especially as we're looking at this summit, more ambitious plans for Ukraine, ambitious war plans that would require every member to be acting in concert with militaries that are fighting together against Russia? I mean, are those plans sort of executable in this type of political environment where we still see a lot more nationalism on both sides of the Atlantic?
Sure, and a lot of people will comment on the European elections. I was just in Paris, and after those elections, Macron disbanded the General Assembly that I met with. However, they're all still very pro-Ukraine. And I don't see that diminishing. In fact, that's rallied NATO together. It's kind of a rallying point for them. I think, from a foreign policy standpoint, the United States, we're saying, look, we're going to be there, but it's your backyard, and you need to kind of step it up. The good news is, again, I think only 8 countries have not met the 2% goal. How long do we have to keep 100,000 troops over in Europe? That's going to be another issue. Look, we're going to help you, but you need to be prepared to defend yourself as well.
Well, I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about these war plans in this moment in NATO. Obviously, there's much more investment in defense, as you said, but still sort of the straw that stirs the drink is the American forces coming across the Atlantic. I'm curious how you think, from a congressional perspective, from a public perspective, are Americans in support of that, of supporting our NATO allies and defending our NATO allies with boots on the ground when push comes to shove?
Yeah, I think Americans want America, United States, to lead the free world, and we do. Like, the Repo Act that I passed and the supplemental, now EU countries are starting to take, that's where you can attach to the Russian sovereign assets of the oligarchs that were frozen. However, they want us to lead, but they don't want us to bear the entire burden sharing. And I think and I tell this to our European allies, that look, the more you can have it more of a burden sharing agreement here, and I think it is, the better off you're going to be, and the more support you're going to get from the United States. I think we're going to go through a transition since World War II of having so many troops in Germany, for instance, and South Korea. It's a very dangerous time. I wouldn't recommend diminishing that number, but we are going to have to look at a transition where, Europe has its own bases. It doesn't have to be borne by the United States alone.
That's a fascinating question, too, of priorities. You spend a lot of time in the Indo-Pacific, in Taiwan. Almost every trip we were talking about that you're taking either has a Europe leg or an Indo-Pacific leg to it. How are you talking about this challenge with European allies of prioritization? Because when they look at the enablers, at the troops that they would need a lot of American support in an Article 5 scenario, but that support could be in the Indo-Pacific.
That's correct. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we have 2 hot wars in a hot zone. So the Pacific theater is, I think, even more treacherous than the European theater, but they're tied together. And what I would remind my colleagues, like, you can't say you're like somehow like Russia gets a pass, but you're anti-communist China, because Chairman Xi met with Putin at the Beijing Olympics, and they forged this unholy alliance together. And guess who else is in there? Ayatollah and Kim Jong-un. They recently met, Putin and Kim Jong-un, who has resupplied the Russian military, China. Why aren't we sanctioning China? We should. But China's a threat in the Pacific as well. I would argue that if you look at our military in terms of GDP, if you go back to early 1980s, Reagan, we're far less and we're far behind than we were back then. Our military is overstretched and overburdened right now, which is why Europe has to help take care of itself. So we can also look at what happens in Ukraine also impacts what happens in Taiwan. And by the way, 90% of the advanced semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan. If China invaded tomorrow, that all goes under, and it would be devastating, the consequences there. So the other thing that's completely overstressed, and doesn't get talked about enough, is our defense industrial base. Because I look at the weapons, so I sign off on them, and our defense industrial base cannot handle the stress they are getting from these 2 wars, and again, the Pacific. I sign off on weapons, 22 weapon sales to Taiwan, going back 4 years ago, that have yet to go into Taiwan. If that gives you any sense for how stressed our defense industrial base is, and that's dangerous, because that's our deterrence to a conflict.
Lot to talk about on readiness. We've got about 20 seconds left. Any big things you're looking for out of the NATO summit in 20 seconds or less?
Well, I know Rutte. I met with him in the Netherlands. It was a great pick. I think he's going to be a very good UN Secretary General. And I think all the NATO countries are looking forward to that. I hope that, I just hope they come out more unified than ever, and I think they will, and rally behind the new Secretary General, but also rally behind this, what I see is a just war against an aggressive dictator who has caused a lot of war crimes, by the way. A lot of people forget about the war crimes. And the children. I'm glad you mentioned the children's hospital being bombed. That's what the Russians do. They've kidnapped 30,000 Ukrainian children to indoctrinate them against their own country and then send them to the battlefield. I mean, I hope we see a unified NATO. I think we will. And the United States also standing up to dictators all across the world.
We'll be watching that closely. Chairman McCall, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.